This morning we have Roger Miners with us. He's the Goolsbee Distinguished Professor of Economics and Law at the University of Texas in Arlington. He is also a longtime PERC Senior Fellow. He has numerous publications and thought a lot about the intersection between common law and markets and the environment. I think after listening to Roger, you will probably agree with me, but we can have a discussion on this, that the common law is perhaps not so common anymore. Thanks for joining us, Roger.
Thank you, Holly. What I want to focus on, as Holly said, is to think about the interaction of law, economics, and environmental problems, and focusing more on individual ingenuity in handling problems that occur, in thinking of ways to remedy problems, in people bringing suit to protect their interests that come to us from a very long tradition in England of property rights going back hundreds and hundreds of years, because traditionally wealth was in real property. 90% of the population was involved in agriculture. So your little bit of land and your chickens and cows and pigs and crops were your most important assets, and so that's where most litigation occurred. Modern commerce doesn't come about really until the 1800s that we begin to see enough contracting that contract law becomes more important. But for hundreds of years we had ordinary landowners dealing with ordinary problems in their lives in England, and we brought over that English heritage. And when the US split away from the UK, we dumped the government, but we kept the common law. Most of the states had a provision in their constitution that said something along the lines of, we're setting up a new state government, but we retain the common law. So the common law worked just fine, and it's an ancient tradition, and it's stronger in the US than it is in England today, where they have gutted a lot of the common law by detailed administrative controls in many areas that we don't have. So for a long time, until we got to the modern environmental era, which begins in 1970, the government had very little to do. The federal government especially had very little to do with the environment. You had a few statutes running around, the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, which wanted to make sure that certain rivers and harbors were navigable and that cities didn't do stupid things to make rivers impassable and so on. But it was pretty much handled at the individual level, people bringing lawsuits, there were thousands and thousands of suits, as well as actions taken by state and local governments. The federal regulatory regime begins about 1970 and of course dominates what we see today, but the common law is still there and people still have strong incentives to protect the environment, as we get lots of litigation going on today. And what I want to do is contrast the regulatory regime that we have lived under since the early 70s to more of an individual approach, thinking about dealing with environmental problems. The South, like other areas, but the South in particular, suffered terrible soil erosion because of bad agricultural practices. Of course, the whole Dust Bowl was created by what we later learned were bad agricultural practices, but it was compounded by certain weather conditions. But in the South, when they had quit planting cotton in certain areas, when the soil was exhausted, then they had this terrible erosion problem. And so landowners' land becomes pretty much worthless. You got this kind of runoff going on, and you can't grow cotton in it anymore, so they're looking for what to do with their land. And so this problem was handled by the federal government. The U.S. Department of Agriculture stepped in and came up with the solution called kudzu. And those of you from the South or have been through the South are well aware of kudzu, which now covers thousands of square miles and is a major environmental problem. I think it illustrates the problem of having a bunch of smart people who are well-meaning and well-educated thinking about, we need to come up with a solution to this problem that we see today. They didn't think about soil erosion as an environmental problem. That's a more new term. It was a soil erosion. What are we going to do about it? And so they heard about this fast-growing plant brought it over from Japan, and it was a big success, all right. It took over. Of course, you can't do anything else with that land because the kudzu kills out everything else that's in its way. So now we have programs through USDA to kill the kudzu, to get rid of it. One size doesn't fit all. That is, what might make sense in one location rarely makes sense for everybody. Environmental conditions are different in different places, and the odds are that any one decision maker does have limited knowledge. We can't know everything. Nobody does, no matter how smart somebody is. There's always more to know, and new information to be discovered as we move through time. So what seemed like a highly scientific resolution to the problem in the 1930s turned out to be wrong. And now we're paying the cost of it and spending a lot of money trying to rip this out. It's the problem of a one-size-fits-all regulatory standard, which most regulatory standards tends to be. Here's the rule. You all got to follow the rule, and if you don't, we can come hit you with sticks for violating this federal rule. And if you're in compliance with a federal rule, then you tend to be okay, which can cause problems on its own, as we'll get to later. So in all areas of the environment, under the modern environmental regime, we see these kind of one-size-fits-all resolutions as the EPA is the primary agency, tries to come up with solutions to problems that do exist and we want dealt with. As you know, there's a lot of plastic in the ocean. And the reason is that in most countries, garbage is disposed of by shoving it into the ocean. The vast majority of people live along the ocean or waterways and always have. And so you have giant cities such as Lagos, Nigeria, where they just bulldoze and shove the stuff out into the ocean and eventually it gets washed away. In poor places such as Lagos and many other cities, they can't really start trash collection as we know it. Get a whole bunch of trucks to drive around town and pick up little bags and haul them off to central dump locations and so on. It's just too expensive, the land is too valuable. This is the cheapest way to deal with it, which of course is not a very good way to deal with it. It's causing all kinds of problems. Now the way we handle trash is quite different. We have contained landfills. That's state of the art. It's changed over time as the EPA standards for landfills has changed over time. This is the state of the art where you have multiple layers at the bottom, a thick plastic basically, and then you fill it up with trash, and then eventually you're done and you put more stuff over the top and dump a bunch of dirt on it and plant plants on top and usually turn it into a park or something like that. It's not a good idea to build a house on top of it because it's going to sink, but it's perfectly safe to use it for recreational purposes. And of course, this waste material will tend to vent some gas, in particular methane. And so there are some vent collections that are there. And usually, if there's enough coming out, you put a little cap on it. It sucks the gas out. The gas is captured so that it just doesn't vent straight into the atmosphere because methane is a particularly bad gas greenhouse gas to put into the environment. So that's our state of the art. It's let's preserve our trash so that archaeologists 1,000 years from now can come dig it up and it's all nicely encapsulated so they can see what we ate and what we read and all of those kinds of things. State of the art trash control. But it doesn't always work so well. It hasn't worked very well or caused a problem in Bozeman. We had a nice trash bin outside of town, and when it was finished, they covered it over, did everything right, but then gas starts seeping out of the bottom. It's pretty hard to completely encapsulate a multi-acre thing like this and not have little holes get in it. So as you can see, there are homes that are built right along the edge of the former landfill, which is now closed, except for you can take grass and clippings and things like that there. But the homes along there realized that there was a small amount of gas emerging, seeping from the closed landfill. Very common problem of gas seepage around the bottom of the landfill. Well, you can imagine what it does to the value of these houses. Do you want to buy a house that has gas emissions, coming out from this landfill? I don't think it's a toxic time bomb waiting to go off. Now, it turns out that the gas that comes out is, in fact, as best we know, pretty harmless. Nobody's going to get sick from it. It's a very low level. But that's the kind of thing we all worry about, right? Why would you buy that house if you can go over there and get one and it doesn't have these gas emissions that are coming out? So there was, of course, litigation. The homeowners sue the city for basically allowing them to build. They knew the dump was there. The dump was still open when those houses were built, but they were basically promised once the dump is closed, it'll all be all safe, you won't have to put up with stinky garbage anymore, and so on. So they had a settlement of this. I think it turned out to be close to $300,000 per house, because there's 22 homes that were involved in the thing. So these encapsulated landfills are not perfect. And why should we want to preserve our garbage for posterity? Are we that interesting that archaeologists in the future should want to come dig through our debris and admire everything that we have? Well, there are people who specialize in this. How do you build dumps and treat garbage? There's new ways to do it. Technology that says, okay, you collect all of the stuff and put it in a waste facility that the ones that are being experimented with have 4 compartments in it. So it's where you first bring the stuff and dump it in, and then they dump in some microbes. It's a scientific term, microbes, bacteria, stuff like that. Get it to eat the garbage. Because garbage tends to bubble up on its own. And then you close that after a couple of years and move the trash to the next area, and you throw more microbes in, and you cover this thing over. It emits an incredible amount of gas because you're boiling the garbage down. And the estimates are to take about 20 years to complete a cycle where you get back to the dump that was closed, the microbes have done their job and eaten everything away, it's all been emitted in the form of gas. You capture the gas, and there's a lot of it. A large landfill would produce enough methane and gas to heat about 1,000 homes. So you could tap it into the existing system instead of a piddly amount of gas that comes out of the landfills today. Then you go through and mine what is left, because there's going to be some metals and stuff like that that aren't going to degrade. Go and clean that up, and essentially it can be hopefully a near eternal landfill. And then you don't have the problem of where do you start a new landfill. When the landfill in Bozeman, which was started years and years ago, kind of out on the sticks, edge of town, nobody lived out there, so nobody cared. That's where you always put your garbage, where it doesn't bother anybody. But Bozeman grew, and they put a golf course next to the landfill and built expensive homes around it. So then those people start yapping about, well, we don't like living next to a landfill. Well, you knew it was there when you built your house. Why are you whining? But we had to get rid of our trash somewhere. So in Bozeman now, it's shipped up the road to a small, poor town called Logan, small town. So we put it all in trucks and hauled it about 30 miles up the highway, and the little town of Logan was offered a lot of money by Bozeman to take our garbage. And the people there said, oh, okay, we don't have any better alternative, so we'll take your garbage. So garbage disposal is always a big problem. And if you try to come up with new garbage dumps in existing large cities, it takes too much space, it's valuable property, nobody wants to live near these things, and you've got the whole complex method problem of collecting it. So we now have this new technology that says we can have essentially perpetual landfills. They'll be very different, they're completely enclosed, because you're going to have a lot of chemical activity going on in there, biological activity, as this trash is eating itself and emitting gases that can be captured and then reused for heating, electrical generation, and so on. And you get a little bit of compost and minerals out at the other end. The problem is this is illegal. Even though it's state-of-the-art technology, and people who spend their lives studying this kind of thing, civil engineers that work in garbage problem, say, this looks like a really cool thing to do. You can have one landfill and it's probably going to be there forever, so you don't end up with a problem like you do in Bozeman. Whoops, the old landfill is full. What are we going to do? So we're going to ship our garbage miles away because rich people in Bozeman don't want to have to smell their own garbage. We'll buy the rights from some poor people up the road that'll take our garbage. Instead, you can have one landfill that may last us forever. So they're looking at building one of these in Accra, Ghana, and one in Thailand. Can't build it in the US yet. I ran across something this morning that said they're looking at doing this in the Salt Lake area for food waste. It would be one of these modern facilities that will eat up the food waste relatively quickly. They're pretty easy to get rid of and capture the gases from it. Why haven't we moved in that direction? We got one-size-fits-all regulation. We've got the scientific landfills that were designed decades ago. That's what the regulation says you have to do. You can experiment with this stuff if you want, but a city is not in compliance with EPA regulations if they try one of these new, more modern forms of waste disposal that the engineers tell us will work well, and the chemists that work on it say, oh yeah, this will work quite well. But no, it violates the regulation. Now maybe it'll happen someday, but there's not much incentive for the waste industry to invest in this kind of thing. Because as long as you're in compliance with the current environmental standards, these old regulations about encapsulated landfills, you're golden. The problem in Bozeman was kind of peculiar to Bozeman. And it wasn't the waste management company that got sued, it was the city of Bozeman for allowing this to happen in that location. So industry tends to buy into whatever the existing regulatory standard is. You've paid for it, you're in compliance with it, it's pretty simple technology, there's not a lot of incentive to invest in better ways to address pollution problems or waste problems because you're meeting federal standards today. Now the people at EPA are quite aware of this new technology, and there's some people there that are thinking about it, and there's some international organizations that are providing the funding for looking at maybe building these new type of disposal facilities in some poor countries where they don't have the ability to set up the kind of fancy trash disposal system we have, but this new kind of system may be environmentally better anyway. And leapfrogs, just like in a lot of poor countries, they never had landlines. They went straight from no phones to cell phones. Used leapfrog the technology. And that's what some poor countries are now looking at doing. So people in Lagos, in the city of Lagos, they don't want to shove all their garbage into the ocean for forever. So they're thinking about this kind of technology instead. It's tough to make that change. Because once everybody's invested in the current technology, and we're all in compliance with the current standards of how to dispose of our garbage, there's not a lot of pressure for change. Not a lot of interest groups that are going to say, oh, let's invest in this new kind of expensive disposal facility. Why should we? We're already meeting compliance standards, and so there's no reason to move in that direction. One size fits all technology. We came up with that system years ago. We tend to follow it pretty well. It's not foolproof by any means. It does cause problems, as we've seen here, but it's tough to put together a system that will allow innovation and say, let's try other ways of doing it. Maybe it'll come through some of the other countries that are willing to make that leap into the new technology. Water pollution, of course, is a constant problem throughout time. And when I've been in other countries, I refuse to eat seafood because I know dang good well where that stuff comes from. In most countries, they pump raw sewage into the waterways. The Mediterranean is filthy. Advanced countries, or what we think of as advanced countries like France and Italy, pump raw sewage into the Mediterranean. And I can eat the fish that hang around there, eat that stuff. I don't know, maybe if it's cooked enough, it's okay, but it doesn't seem like a good idea to me to be doing this. So this is how most sewage is still disposed of around the world. Pump it away. Pump it into a water body. Now we began with the Clean Water Act began to set some national standards, saying we don't want you pumping so much sewage as well as toxic industrial waste. We don't want all this stuff going into waterways. So we're going to start having effluent standards, and we're going to spend a lot of money building sewage treatment plants and so on. And so the U.S. is pretty advanced in that regard, and yet we still have a lot of contamination in our waterways, fecal contamination map. Here in Montana, we're pretty clean. We get a pretty good score. That's because our population is low, and the bodies of water tend to move pretty fast. Where you have more people still living, like in this area, and you don't have rivers moving as fast, they get a lot more because a certain amount of sewage ends up seeping into waterways. EPA really doesn't know a lot about this. A few years ago, I haven't looked recently, but a few years ago I looked to see how much detailed information does EPA have on all of the waterways in America. Measures of, concentrations of this, that, and the other thing. It's not hard to do. You get a beaker full of water and run it through a machine to tell you what all is in it. They have very little information. It isn't because they don't care. It's because Congress won't give them money to do a lot of research in this area. Who is opposed to having more knowledge about the problems created by wastes that go into waterways? Who's the biggest opponent of that? It tends to be agricultural interests. Most of our biggest water pollution problems in the U.S. come from runoff from agricultural operations. And even though there's only a tiny number of farmers left in this country, they have immense political clout. Because every state, except maybe Rhode Island, every state has a few farms in it, and those farmers are organized through various organizations. And every time EPA has raised their antenna and say, we got a problem with a lot of nitrogen runoff in these rivers, they've been smacked down by Congress. Congress doesn't want to hear about it. So we do a pretty good job regulating emissions from industrial entities, Dow Chemical and those kind of people. They're pretty tightly controlled, so our water problems tends to be runoff from agricultural operations and city sewage systems that are not that good. So this problem continues, even though cities are supposed to be in compliance. The city of Milwaukee has been notorious throughout history for pumping raw sewage into Lake Michigan. It resulted in decades of litigation between Milwaukee and Chicago because they drink out of the same lake. That's where most of their drinking water comes from. And the city of Chicago had to spend more money cleaning up the lake water because it has sewage in it from Lake Michigan. So eventually, this ended up in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court back in 72 says that, you can't be pumping raw sewage into the lake. It violates the common law right of the people of Illinois not to have polluted water coming down to them. So you people in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Milwaukee, you need to do something about this. We're going to issue an injunction against the city of Milwaukee. Stop pumping raw sewage into Lake Michigan. That's the cheapest way to get rid of it, to be sure. You have to do something about it. Build yourself a proper sewage treatment plant. And of course, the city of Milwaukee didn't want to spend the money on it, and they drug their feet. And luckily for them, a couple months after the Supreme Court issued its ruling in the case of Milwaukee going against Chicago, the Clean Water Act got passed. The Clean Water Act says, this day forward, feds are in charge, we've kind of nationalized water quality for the country. Milwaukee went back to the Supreme Court and said, we've got this new statute that says EPA is going to control water quality, and so this common law suit gets knocked out. The Supreme Court agreed. So EPA is in charge now, so we're going to withdraw our previous order that you have to do something about it. EPA is now in charge of going around and making sure that cities are in compliance. And eventually the city of Milwaukee did get a very generous grant from Congress to build a nice sewage treatment plant. So the city of Chicago where people already had paid for sewage treatment, they got, as federal taxpayers, to chip in to pay for Milwaukee, Wisconsin's sewage treatment plant. So it turns out to be, of course, a federal scramble in Congress. Who's going to get the bucks? And senior members of Congress, people that have important positions on the oversight committees, they're going to get the most money for their districts, whether that's the most needed place or not. But it's kind of hard to give a good rationale for why people in Montana or Illinois should chip in to pay for sewage treatment in Milwaukee. It's pretty much a local problem. It doesn't have any impact on Montana, what they're doing there. And the common law rule was, clean up your own mess. You don't have the right to dump your mess, your sewage on anybody else. Clean it up. We're not going to tell you exactly how to do it. It's up to you to figure out what's the best technology to use, given your local conditions of how to deal with this problem. But this problem continues to get a big rainstorm there, and it overwhelms their sewage treatment system, and they dump a bunch of raw sewage right into Lake Michigan. I checked the paper the other day. They had a dump last summer of over 100 million gallons of raw sewage that went into Lake Michigan. So we still have these problems. They're still around, despite we've had 40-some years now of federal subsidies to help cities pay for fancy water sewage treatment systems. Their incentive is, let's wait until we come up on the federal list and we get more support. The common law, or our traditional rule of law, was riparian water law, which vaguely said people have the right to reasonably clean water. Now, it's kind of on a case-by-case basis because different locales have different standards and so on. Case went to the High Court of New York, called the Court of Appeals, in 1913. And at that time, it was certainly the most important state Supreme Court, and in many ways was the most important court in the United States because it handled important common law matters that the Supreme Court of the U.S. doesn't. This paper mill was built on a river in New York, Union Magnet Paper Company, brand new state-of-the-art paper mill. And it polluted whatever the river was, ran by the paper mill, sucked in clean water, something happens as they're making paper and spits out heavily polluted water. Farmer Whalen lives downstream of the river, of the paper mill. And the water's so dirty that it'll make his cows sick if they drink it. And he can't use the water to irrigate his vegetables that he's growing. He never drank the river water himself, but he can't put it on his plants or let his animals drink it. So he had to drill a separate well to produce water for his animals and his crops. And he sued the Union Magnet Paper Company. Said, you violated my common law right to reasonably clean water. And the local court agreed, the district court agreed, and awarded him $312 in damages, the cost of drilling a new well, and issued an injunction against the paper mill. Stop it. And we know it's going to take a little bit of time to do it, so we're not saying you got to stop pollution instantly, but we're going to give you like 6 months or a year. You better have some progress made on this. The intermediate court overturned that decision, went to the High Court of New York, and they reinstated the district court's decision and said, yeah, the damages are correct, but also the injunction is correct. And they said, look, the damages suffered by the farmer were small, $312. And one of the defenses posed by Union Magnet Paper, we spent $1 million, that's real money in those days, building this brand new mill. We employ more than 500 people. We're the largest employer in this county. And this crazy court is talking about shutting us down. You can't destroy that much stuff. And the High Court of New York said, look, the cost to you may be more than the damage to the plaintiff, but you knew what the law was when you built this mill. This isn't some new rule that says you can't destroy a waterway with pollution. So the fact that you're going to suffer a large loss if you get shut down is not a good reason to refuse an injunction. Rights are rights. And we're not going to do a cost-benefit analysis and say, oh, well, the value of the water to the mill is a lot higher than it is to a few little farmers downstream. Neither course of equity nor law could be guided by such a rule. Otherwise, it's easy for those wealthy and powerful to essentially steal resources from those less able to handle the litigation and who don't have assets as valuable as this brand new paper mill. So it could be a pretty stiff rule that you would get from the courts. And this is not an uncommon holding. The Supreme Court of the US had cases, interstate pollution cases, air and water. Same kind of thing. The court said, pay for the damage you've done, and we're issuing an injunction against you. Stop it. We don't care how you stop it. That's up to you. You're the experts in the industry. You figure out how to deal with this technical problem. But you've got to reduce your emissions to a level that they no longer cause so much harm to your neighbor. So that was the essential system we had in place. And there were thousands of cases that were brought as ordinary landowners like Farmer Whalen sued this polluter that was reducing the value of their property. The system worked pretty well. And the plaintiffs won an overwhelming majority of the cases. Because when you get a local jury together and say, this big bad company is dumping pollution on a bunch of little farmers, of course they always side with the local guys against the big bad company that is doing this. And so the plaintiffs tended to win the majority of the cases. We haven't abandoned this. This is still there in bits and pieces. But once you get to the Clean Water Act of 1972, Congress is essentially saying we're nationalizing water, just like we nationalized the airshed. And it's up to EPA now, working with the states, to come up with regulatory controls that will determine the proper level of emissions that will be allowed into waterways and so on. So the feds have been in charge now for some time, and we have much, much less of this kind of litigation. One of the problems Farmer Whalen would face today, let's say you get the new paper mill built, and they install water treatment equipment that meets federal standards. But he said, there's still too much pollution in the river compared to what it was like before. The fish are dead, my cows get sick, and so on. So I don't care they've got pollution control. It's not doing a very good job. I'm suffering too much harm for this. When he sues the company, of course, he's got to bear the cost of litigation himself. EPA is going to be sitting on the other side of the table. They're going to be there saying, that company's in compliance, doing a good job. We think that this is a very sensible standard. EPA's not going to show up and say, oh, yeah, our regulations are totally inadequate, or we stupid. No. They're going to say, well, this company is meeting the standards, they're good corporate citizens, and so on. So you're going against not only the polluter, and juries tend not to have a lot of sympathy for polluters, but if on the other side, you've got folks from the regulatory agency saying, these are good guys. They're meeting our tough standards. That's a really tough burden for Farmer Whalen to overcome. You better have pretty sound scientific evidence, and that's not cheap to put together. So litigation is a lot more difficult today. The environment's a lot cleaner, of course, today than it was 100 years ago. But it's often difficult for plaintiffs to bring suit against polluters because if the polluter is in compliance with the regulatory standards, that's a pretty strong defense. We're doing what we're supposed to. We spent all this money on this pollution control. It's a state of the art as dictated by the EPA or whatever agency happens to be in charge. Air pollution, of course, talk a little bit about land and water. Air is the other biggie, and really the toughest of all. Land pollution is pretty simple to control. Water pollution, we know a lot about it. Air is tougher because it tends to spread over a large area, and things that are done 2 states away may impact us. But one thing we see by going back and looking at emission levels is that they began to come down. This is London, but it's the same in the US. They began to come down 100 years ago. Before there was any regulatory control, emissions were falling. Even though the population of London was rising, you had more people living there, but less emission was being suffered by the residents of London over time. So what's happening? Even in the absence of a lot of regulatory or statutory controls, we see improvements in air quality in London and in the US. This is in the US, indoor air quality. Our air standards measure outside air, right? You've got these little meters that spin around and they take measures of the major pollutants that are listed there. But the average human spends 90 to 95% of their time indoor, not outdoor. So it's really indoor air quality that matters a lot to what we breathe. And here we see that using 1940 as the baseline, all of these major pollutants were dropping rapidly, measured inside of houses and stores and hotels and buildings, were dropping rapidly prior to 1970. Before the Clean Water or Clean Air Act was passed, air quality was getting better and better. Most of the major pollutants were dropping rapidly. There was no regulation in place. Why did it happen? Why did air quality get better? Because we all like clean air. And what people used to do was have a furnace in the building that burned coal or heating oil. And some of you, especially if you're from the East, may have been in some buildings that had heating oil furnaces. They stink, and the reason they stink, those are emissions that we're smelling from that. Once better technology came along, people bought natural gas furnaces, electric heat, things that are much cleaner to produce heat. It's primarily, most of the problem comes from heating, not from air conditioning. It comes from heating. So when better technology becomes available, people tend to buy it. We all want our house to smell better instead of having a stinky coal burning furnace or oil burning furnace, and that technology was adapted. No regulations were necessary. Instead, it was companies coming up with better technology to offer building owners and homeowners to say, your house will smell better if you have a natural gas furnace than one of these stinky old oil burning furnaces. So there's always competition among the producers of equipment to make equipment that doesn't smell as producing emissions that are as bad, and we tend to want that stuff. And so as a society becomes wealthier, we make those kind of investments. The old furnace worked fine. It's too stinky. Who wants to live with that? So richer people can afford to buy better environmental quality for themselves and give an incentive to producers to produce equipment that generates fewer emissions that people have to put up with. If you go down I-90 going west, about 100 miles, you'll see that. At the time it was built in Anaconda, Montana, it was the tallest smokestack in the world. I think it's over 500 feet tall. The Anaconda Butte area was a source of the most wealth for Montana going back 100 years. The mining activity, all the money came from there. And so you had these giant companies that owned mining and smelting operations. Smelting operations are filthy, produce a lot of heavy toxic chemical emissions that come out of them. Ranchers that lived nearby didn't like all of the stuff that was coming down out of the atmosphere on them and their cows. And so they sued. So you've got these little landowners, these ranchers, taking on the most powerful vested interest in the state of Montana, Anaconda Copper and other giant metal producing companies. The landowners won. In fact, they won all the cases they brought for both air and water pollution. And that's pretty obvious. You're doing stuff that's reducing the value of their property. It's not doing their cows any good to graze on the brush or whatever they eat that has got these chemicals that have come down and landed on the plant life. Stop it. In, 100 years ago or more, this was the best solution. Build a really tall smokestack instead of a 20-foot smokestack that just dumps it out like that. If it goes up 500 feet into the atmosphere, that dispenses it over a much broader area and didn't cause any measurable harm to any one landowner. They also installed a bunch of filters that began to capture a lot of the particulate matter. So 100 years ago, they were making that investment because nearby landowners sued them. Now, what the landowners couldn't prove at that time was that they were suffering damage. You're breathing this stuff, it's probably not doing you any good. But scientific evidence 100 years ago wasn't very good about the harm to human health from most stuff. Instead, the evidence was the cow ate the brush and fell over dead because of the pollution that was on the brush. Okay, we can see that. That's damage to your property. You got to stop it. There's a lot of litigation in the 1960s against the aluminum makers along the Columbia River Gorge. Columbia River attracted a lot of industrial investment, especially aluminum manufacturing, which uses a lot of electricity. And the US government had built a whole bunch of dams along the Columbia River and Snake River and had a surplus of electricity. They're basically giving away the electricity. Please come to the Northland, we'll give you electricity for your industrial purpose. So you get companies like Hardy Aluminum, it was later acquired by Alcoa, that has a smelter in the Dalles. 550 people work there. The town's population was about 3,000, so this was the dominant company in town. But they issued, or had some emissions that were doing damages to fruit crops nearby, pears and apricots and other things that grew in orchards near the Dalles. They sued Harvey Aluminum. And the court said, as we would expect, one, pay for the damage you've done, you've ruined their crop. Number two, we're issuing an injunction against you. Stop it. We don't know how, but we just presume it can be stopped, or maybe you're just going to have to shut down and go find out something else to do for a living. So the company had a strong incentive, figure out better technology to control these emissions, and they did. It was expensive, but controlling a lot of pollution is expensive because the hammer they were facing is be shut down by the court. Because the court was very clear, just as with Farmer Whalen, the federal court in this case said you don't have the right to impose that kind of damage on your neighbors, and so you're either going to pay for what you've done, and you're going to stop it, figure out a way to reduce emissions to a level that doesn't cause measurable harm, or you're going to have to shut down your operation, go somewhere else for a living. You don't get that under the regulatory regime. Now, my own hypothesis, and this is hard to piece together from the evidence, is that this is one reason industry was happy to sign on to the Clean Air Act. Clean Air Act was passed with strong support from big industrial polluters. Set a standard, and guess who will help you write the standards? Because you can't have a bunch of nitwit lawyers at the EPA writing technical standards for aluminum production. You got to bring in experts from the aluminum industry. They really do know how this stuff works. So usually the industry plays a very large role in helping to write, can be thought of as best practices in the industry at the time the regulation was written. So all of these special interests that were faced with getting smacked by the regulations, they bought into this. There was years of debate in Congress about this. So the modern era comes about of the modern environmental regulatory area happens in a hurry. And for some reason, when you think Richard Nixon, Watergate, why isn't he remembered as the great environmental president? This was his administration. That his administration's version of the Clean Water Act is pretty much where we are today, a much more complicated statute than what existed back in 1972. Congress watered down the Clean Water Act because the administration was proposing much more extensive federal controls. So all of this comes about from the Nixon administration, who created the EPA by executive order of the president. Is it because Richard Nixon loved the environment and went out and hugged trees and wept when he saw little birds falling from the sky? I don't think he cared about it at all. His big interest seemed to be foreign stuff, go to China, cool things like that. I don't think he cared much about environmental matters, but his supporters told him, look, this stuff's coming. Industry is on board with these statutes, so let's go with it. Fine. If that's what works, we'll go with it. Didn't have a whole lot to do with environmental purity. It had to do with political reality of the day, which is, of course, where you are at any point in time. What do politicians have to deal with? So we end up with, under the current system, which is command and control, federal oversight over most environmental assets, and specific technological regulations. Complex laws don't usually happen overnight. They're years in the making. So in Congress, they had lots of hearings about the proposed Clean Air Act, which was understood to be the biggie. Clean air was the most expensive. So they got thousands of witnesses, very few scientists, very few environmental groups. If you go back to 1968, the Sierra Club was nothing. It was a small organization of backpackers. They weren't involved in all the stuff they're involved in now. All of the industrial groups were there saying, Senator, the law you have proposed is very wise. We think the Clean Air Act would be a wonderful thing. And of course, we want to be good citizens, like every company would like to be. So we applaud you for your action. So the worst polluters were there in Washington promoting these statutes. That's called special interest legislation. But you know, the mythology of it is that somehow, there were environmental problems, and thank goodness President Nixon and other well-meaning members of Congress stepped forward to deal with these problems. There were problems, but industry was getting sued, and the litigation was becoming more and more complex as we began to have more advanced epidemiological evidence of the harms to humans. Having a cow drop dead, that's pretty cheap, right? Cows were, okay, $1,000, here's money for your cow. You injure a human's health, we're into big money now. So I think that was the main reason that industry said, yeah, let's go for these federal controls. The big companies could pay for it. Many of them already had good quality controls. It tended to be the smaller firms that got smacked, the ones that hadn't made the investment or were incapable of making an investment in the good stuff. So this legislation looks like most legislation that comes out of Congress. It's dominated by special interests. The people who know they're going to be subject to these costly rules, they're at the table first. And members of Congress listen to these people because they do a lot of employment, they make campaign contributions, blah, 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 put together the support that you need to get elected to Congress and re-elected. The environmental groups come along later. They begin to play off of the modern environmental regulatory regime that we have, which allows citizens to sue. Citizen suits, real simple. You go and put a beaker under a regulated pipe, go have a test run on it. If you can show that this polluter is emitting more than their permit allows, you've won the case. And the attorney's fees are paid. So there's plenty of attorneys, mainly the litigation wing of organizations such as Sierra Club, that earn their living off of using the citizen suit provision. It's kind of dumb, simple law to do this stuff. That's fine, somebody's got to enforce the statutes, but we don't see as much true common law litigation in the sense of ordinary property owners taking steps to go after those that they think are doing harm to their person or their property. We have a system in place, very detailed regulations, industry by industry. Technology standards are set. And so when these things come about, there is a knockdown, drag-out fight over the rule that is going to be adopted. Because EPA isn't going to say, y'all go choose whatever technology you want and tell us how it's working. They set a technology standard everybody's going to follow. Some firms are going to be winners, some are going to be losers, so there's a lot at stake that they're going to fight out over this as it happens. And that's the regulatory regime that we operate in today that has many special interests, the lawyers that make their living off of exploiting the citizen suit provisions, industry, of course, that is going to remain at the table. So we've pretty much moved to command and control in much of the environment. Kind of one-size-fits-all regulation where you get things like USDA years ago, oh, kudzu, that's the solution for soil runoff and our system of dry landfills, encapsulated landfills. Technology gets frozen in place, and the same technical rule, which may make good sense in some cases, is imposed on everybody. Everybody's got to do it, and changing to a different technology is very difficult. And there's usually no incentive to adopt a better technology. Why should you bear the cost? If you've invested in the technological standard set by the regulators, you're pretty much golden. So you're okay. These days, of course, a lot of environmentalism is a big political win. Nobody's ever run for office in decades saying, I think we need more pollution. We'd be a lot better off if we had more pollution and that increased economic activity and so on. So people tend to line up with whoever the politician of their choice is and think this will be the person who has this incredible wisdom to solve all of these problems. No, they can't. I don't care who that person is. It's the knowledge problem. The knowledge has to be so complex and cover so many areas, nobody can solve it. And we're better off allowing a lot of local experimentation, state experimentation, instead of presuming that the feds ought to control it all and set one standard for everybody. Then you're going to have some that say, yep, that's the best standard of all. And if you look carefully, it's usually because it's going to be real cheap for them to meet that standard. Those that can't, they're going to be the ones that fight it. Now, originally, one of the justifications for why do we need these federal standards is to prevent what was called a race to the bottom. Some states will sell their soul to industry, right? Someplace like Louisiana or Mississippi, we're the most suspect of all. They'll say, all you industrial polluters, come on down here and build, and we'll let you do anything you want because we'll create a lot of jobs, better than what we got now. And that's going to happen. Turns out it didn't happen. There's been a lot of detailed work on that done by law professors who've gone back and looked at the state level regulatory regimes. All states want to improve their environment. Nobody wants to be known as the toilet of the country where all the sewage gets dumped. Nobody wants to live there, including the people that live there. So the states have learned there is value from environmental quality, just as landowners and property owners have learned. There's value in environmental quality. It makes our property more valuable and our lives more valuable. Nothing can ever be perfect. There's always going to be experimentation and mistakes. We've gone down the route of federal control, which tends to be command and control, one size fits all, which tends not to work in at least some areas.
So I'm curious about, we talked about scientific standards, and a few things come to mind because I've done some research. I had to take some of the ethics classes that correspond with that. Mm-hmm. But for industry, getting scientific studies to back up their product or how it's going would be easier. But for those individuals like you and me, how would we show the scientific standard that we are being injured? We can't say, I just feel gross when you started this. I feel like it's also pushed us. It's not just this, the regulations, but also our standard as society of what to prove we've been injured, I guess.
Yeah, I think in some sense the standard has been the same for a long time. You must be able to show harm. And if you go back a long time ago, the harm was these plants are dead. My cow is sick. It probably wasn't doing them any good either, but we didn't have all the modern blood tests and so on that you do today. So some of those tests are pretty cheap to run these days. How much lead is in your system? That's an easy one to figure out. Others are not. But yeah, the level of scientific discourse has certainly ramped up to a higher level than it was before. So for ordinary litigation, it could probably be much more difficult. Now, on the other hand, the damages tend to be a lot higher. you hurt humans, you're talking about massive damages. Law firms are quite happy to foot the bill on that litigation. There's some areas of litigation that firms have spent $1 billion in background work because they know what the win can be at the other end. So ordinary citizens, yeah, they can't bear the cost of that. But you hire a firm on a contingency basis and they can do it. And they, of course, tend to specialize in various areas of law. And they've got pretty good information. They tend to be in touch with the experts in the area, so they're pretty familiar with it. So if somebody comes to them and says, oh, I think the river behind me is killing me and my children, they're probably going to tell you to go away. That there is nothing there. That we've looked at it, and because we'd be happy to find that happening because it's good litigation for us. They tend to give you pretty good readings on whether there is something there or not. So the litigation process, a lot of people say, oh, we don't want more lawyers. And I think it's a case where lawyers do a lot of good through competition in the court system rather than relying more on administrative law where the rules get put in stone at one point in time. Josh?
How can you apply common law to situations where you have multiple non-point sources where you can't necessarily attribute a health impact or damage to a specific source or company?
Yeah, that is the single biggest problem area that I hate to have to agree with. That something like, say, auto emissions. I could care less how much comes out of my tailpipe because I bear a minuscule fraction of the cost that can be imposed by that. But if we got 200 million people driving stinky cars around, we get a lot of air emissions and we all suffer from it. It's pretty tough to come up with it. Now, you can envision, okay, we have a class action suit where all the citizens of some law firm, on behalf of all citizens affected, they sue all the automakers. And that kind of stuff has been tried. The courts have always said, that's really not for us. We don't want to, you want God, go see Congress. They like to play God. And the courts have always, they want to say, we want particulars much more than these massive class action suits. So you end up with a few oddball cases like that Supreme Court decision in 2007 saying, EPA better do something about greenhouse gases. Where did they come up with that? Whether greenhouse gases are a problem or not, everybody said, this is just bizarre that the Supreme Court would get involved in that. So generally they tend to shy away from it. They say, our job is to make sure whatever statutes are there are reasonably enforced and fairly enforced and so on. So they tend not to. So in the old the air pollution cases like the aluminum smelter in Oregon, we could see who the victims were. And they could bring their particular circumstance. But the one nice thing about those cases is that like the New York High Court, the courts tended to say, rights are rights. And when they're not going to the highest bidder, that is the one that the aluminum company could have easily said, the value of the output of our aluminum factory is a heck of a lot higher than silly pear orchards up the road. You'd buy those out in a heartbeat for that. But the courts were pretty good at saying, rights are rights, and they're not for sale. I think rights are for sale in Congress. That Congress responds to special interests, for better or worse, and they have their say. And those that cannot play a part in that game tend to be the ones that pick up part of the tab for what emerges from that situation. What was passed in the original statute, say the Clean Air Act, it was kind of best practices at that time. It wasn't anything radical. So the big air polluters said, we're already there. We don't have a problem under this. And the later revisions where the standards get tighter and tighter also tended to reflect best industrial practices at the time. So it wasn't like EPA was driven by pure epidemiological evidence on, well, we've got a lot of people with these health problems and we know where it's coming from. They've always been technologically driven. Why? Because Congress tells them, or wrote that into the statute, to be driven by technology. So they can demand you adopt more expensive technology, but they can't do what the courts used to do and say, you're causing a problem, stop it. They don't have that power to do it. So there have been some rather humorous cases of where the polluter said, fine, we'll pay the maximum penalty you can give us because it's cheaper than cleaning up the mess. The city of Atlanta paid $25,000 a day fine to the EPA, well, Treasury, because their water treatment system, the sewage treatment system, was inadequate. They were pumping a lot of raw sewage into the rivers that go through Atlanta. That went on for years and years. And a new system would cost billions of dollars. It's a heck of a lot cheaper to pay $25,000 a day. Now, eventually they got around to building a new system. Under the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, courts do not have the power to say, we're going to slap an injunction against the city of Atlanta. You better come in with evidence in 6 months about specific progress being made on solving this problem, or we can really wreak havoc on you. Now, there's limits on the penalties that are paid under the environmental statutes. And I think that's one of the reasons the industry was pretty comfortable. It pretty much got them away from the fear of lunatic juries coming up with giant awards because of losses suffered by some people or not. The fine system is pretty simple. So most of your water violation fines, it's $1,000. Big deal. Pocket change. You can pay $1,000 a day for a long time. In a big organization, that's nothing. Now, most companies, they don't want to be in trouble. They don't like the publicity from company fine for poisoning your water and endangering your children. So they don't do that. But the penalties are really pretty modest, and judges don't have the kind of power they did under the common law.
Like criminal prosecution, and wouldn't that be a stronger deterrent than what's typically available as a remedy under common law nuisance?
I don't know. Yeah, and I'm not trying to evade this, because there's about 300 criminal convictions a year for violations of various EPA stuff, where they go get the Justice Department to go nail somebody. These are big companies aren't facing this. I mean, they may pay a fine for something, but it's not like we see the CEO of General Electric is not going to prison, right, for them doing bad stuff. These tend to be midnight dumpers and people like that are doing really nasty things. They could have always been nailed under state criminal negligence statutes anyway, that give attorney generals pretty broad power to go after that kind of thing. So I don't know how much of a difference it makes. Now, I think companies are extremely sensitive to bad publicity. So the last thing they want is, General Electric being sued for criminal violations. That's really bad advertising, no matter what happens later. So it certainly does have a deterrent effect. But the deterrent effect is all tied to compliance with existing specific statutes or regulations under those statutes, not something broader.